This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 195 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today's exploration begins with an age-old tale. Colonists migrating to North America in the hopes that they'll find precious metals. Now, unlike the colonists and adventurers who followed the likes of Hernando de Soto out in the West, or those who arrived in the East in Jamestown, Virginia, there was a small group of colonists who settled in Simsbury, Connecticut, just north of present-day Hartford, and around 1705, they found not gold, not silver, but copper. So in part, this is an episode about mining in colonial America. But it's also an episode that explores crime and punishment in early America too, because in 1773, the Connecticut General Assembly purchased the old Simsbury copper mine and turned its tunnels into a prison. So how did an old copper mine function as a prison? This is just one of the many questions Morgan Bengal, a museum assistant at the Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine, will answer for us, as she offers us a look at these two very different early American histories, mining and crime and punishment. And she'll offer us this look as she guides us through the history of the Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine in East Granby, Connecticut. Now, during our exploration, Morgan reveals the history of the founding and operation of the Simsbury, Connecticut copper mine, why the colony of Connecticut purchased the old Simsbury copper mine and turned its tunnels into a prison, and details about the daily lives and experiences of those who served time in the Old Newgate prison between its opening in 1773 and its closure in 1827. But first, we're just 5 episodes away from episode 200. Now, I know that mathematically that's where we're at, just 5 episodes away, but I still can't really believe it. I mean, 200 episodes in nearly 4 years of Ben Franklin's World? Where did the time go? The Omohundro Institute and I want to celebrate this accomplishment and you for all your years of support. So please be sure to subscribe to the Ben Franklin's World newsletter so you don't miss any of the details of our celebration. To subscribe to the newsletter, just text BF World to 33444. All right, are you ready to embark on our exploration of early American mining and prisons? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a museum assistant at the Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine in East Granby, Connecticut. When not working at the Old Newgate Prison, she works as an educator at the New Britain Museum of American Art, where she teaches students about how art and art elements relate to other subjects, such as history and engineering. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Morgan Bengal.
Thank you, Liz. Happy to be here.
So we are definitely going to jump into the specifics of the Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine. But before we do, Morgan, I wonder if you would tell us a bit about the history of the mine and the prison and their historical significance.
Yeah, of course. So the site, first and foremost, is a copper mine. It was established in 1705, and the mine operated until the early 1750s. The mine is significant as the first chartered copper mine in colonial America, and in 1773, the abandoned mine was purchased by the General Assembly of Connecticut to function as a prison. The prison was utilized during the American Revolution, and when Connecticut joined the Union, the result was that Newgate is considered the first state prison in the United States.
Now, how big of a deal was it to find this copper mine in Connecticut? In my mind, it must have been a really big deal because we often hear of colonists who migrated to North America, all with the hope that they would find riches like gold, silver, and copper.
Yeah, exactly. These were most definitely colonial businessmen willing to put their hard work on the line in order to make a profit in the New World, for sure.
How did one start a mine in colonial America? Would you tell us more about the establishment of the Simsbury copper mine?
Yeah, so as you said, they were most likely pretty excited. It started as a rumor of silver and copper in the area, and over the next few years, the residents of what was then Simsbury created a business plan. They initially had a committee to establish and write the articles of agreement between all the contributors, and a committee was established to start the mining operation. The primary people involved were those proprietors, also known as subscribers, and they oversaw all of the operations. But after the copper ore was mined, it was delivered to undertakers who worked to refine the ore. And this is a really, like I said, a really good example of colonial businessmen trying to make a profit and exploit the resources of colonial America.
I'm really curious about the town of Simsbury. You know, when we look at the establishment of towns throughout colonial America, we can often see some commonalities. Like a group of whalers would establish one town, a group of German pietists would establish another town. And I wonder if this was the same case in Simsbury. Was Simsbury established by miners as a mining town? Or, I guess another way to ask this is, which came first, the miners or the discovery of copper ore?
That's a really great question. It's my understanding that those residents who initially discovered the copper just came across it on rumor and knew enough to know that it could be profitable. But later, as more businessmen continued to invest in it, they would bring miners from England and even miners from Germany who were more skilled in the practice itself. And no one was extremely profitable at it, which also proves that they probably didn't have as much experience.
What was mining like back in the 18th century? Because we are talking about an age before steam and gas-powered hydraulic equipment.
Right, so it was probably not very enjoyable. The miners all used hand tools, and they would use those tools to follow the veins of ore. So it's my understanding that from sight, you can detect the quality of the ore more or less. So once the ore was unearthed, it would have been lifted to the surface in buckets. No tracks were laid in the tunnels, only buckets were used to hoist the ore in between the shafts. And once the ore was surfaced, it would have been shipped off to be refined. This process, known as smelting, is used to extract the pure metal from the copper ore, which contains other unnecessary minerals. As difficult as it would have been for them, it was probably a simple technique of hand tools and buckets and then smelting that copper.
How many people did it take to mine the Simsbury copper mine?
So the Simsbury mines were really extensive. And so I don't have a really good understanding of who was all involved. We know that each section kept getting divided between different leasers, and how many miners they required each is a little hard to get a handle on. Probably would have been a big production, but like I said, these miners were simply bringing it up from the ground, and then it would be shipped off to places like Boston and even England to go through that smelting process, and that would have been a whole nother endeavor. This wasn't considered one mine. It was really divided up across the area, so it's hard to get that number.
Okay, so there were many mines and several different owners. Do we know exactly how many mines made up the Simsbury copper mines?
We know that those initial proprietors of Simsbury, about 64 of the residents, initially had control. And when they broke contract with undertakers and took control from the town and a whole bunch of endeavors, they split up what consisted of the mines at that point, probably not very many tunnels to begin with. They split that up. 2/3 went to two men, Partridge was his name, and Jonathan Belcher, and a third of it went to Timothy Woodridge. And from there, it just continues to vein off into different leasers. So like I said, there's a high turnover rate, probably because of the unprofitable nature of the mine. And so they really started dividing up their shares. So it's really hard to grasp who owned what section at what time.
What do we know about the miners who worked the mine? Were they indentured servants or were they free residents of Simsbury? Both?
There was probably a mix of both. We know, like I said, that some of them were brought over from Germany and England, and they would have definitely lived in the area, probably on the site. And then there was probably men who were employed from the local town. There wasn't a huge population in Simsbury at that time, but they were probably employed. Otherwise, more documents are obviously maintained on those businessmen that were trying to make the profit and not as much about the miners. It's definitely an area of research that deserves more attention, and I hope to uncover that a little bit for the miners' sake.
Earlier, you mentioned that these mines weren't exactly profitable, that no one was making lots of money from them. But do we know how much money people made from them? You know, when the town owned the mine, did it benefit from the profits of these mines?
Initially, they were using their profits. It was really tied in with the local town. And so they were using it to pay the town, pay the local minister, the local schoolmaster, and probably even there's records of it supporting the collegiate school Yale. And the remainder was dispersed between the proprietors and undertakers. And in addition to that, well, they weren't making enough money. I can say that for sure. So I know Jonathan Belcher is one example of a man who was involved. He was actually the governor of Massachusetts for a time. And so his documents are really well recorded. So at one point he was not making enough. He needed to be making almost quadruple the amount of ore. So we know not exactly how much they were making, but
clearly they weren't making enough. Now, you've already told us that by 1773, the copper mines had closed and that the Connecticut General Assembly purchased the mines not for their copper, but to convert the tunnels into a prison. Would you tell us more about that story?
Yeah, definitely. So at this time, Newgate was established when colonial America was shifting away from capital and corporal punishment. So until this time, jails were primarily used to hold criminals until their punishment was issued. But the ideology was shifting. Previously, the general idea of predestination caused people to believe that individuals were either born good or born evil. Because of this, criminals were punished to deter crime, but not to reform the criminal. They used methods of humiliation, such as the stocks, and physical punishment, with the intent of determining the rest of society and not reforming that individual. So as the ideology began to shift towards the end of the 18th century, lawmakers and reformers argued that reform was a more viable option. Thus, Newgate was open to serve as an institution for long-term incarceration. The idea of putting prisoners in a mine doesn't seem like an idea of reform, but that's initially how it came about to be open.
So it sounds like for its time, then, the idea of places like Newgate Prison were cutting edge. And I wonder, was Newgate Prison the first prison in the colony of Connecticut?
That's a hard distinction because there were definitely jails, but in terms of the significance that Newgate has is that it's considered the first state prison because it was functioning under the General Assembly of Connecticut when they joined the Union during the American Revolution.
And when exactly did colonists start establishing jails and prisons? Was this something that they did, not long after arriving in North America?
I would say that they start establishing that when their population increases, when they have enough people to have to figure out what to do with, which is what was happening at this time. So the population was starting to boom at the end of the 18th century. And they were also assessing how they wanted to view punishment opposed to the way English did it. So they were starting to shift a little bit and they were assessing how they wanted to handle this. And they didn't want to keep physically punishing people. So they started to assess a better, more viable option. In addition, opening the prison as a workhouse allowed them to make a profit and keep their citizens, their residents, from being idle.
What kinds of crimes were people committing in colonial Connecticut that before 1773 would have warranted a short stay in jail and a physical punishment, and after 1773 would have warranted a stay in the Newgate prison and some sort of reform?
Yeah, they were still doing some of the big ones that we still have today, obviously murder and burglary and robbery. But some other key ones were counterfeiters who were forging documents and money, and then horse thieves, which obviously we don't have today, but that was a pretty popular crime that put prisoners in Newgate prison in particular. So mostly they were robbers, burglars, and counterfeiters and horse thieves.
Earlier, you told us about how the Connecticut General Assembly thought that the old Simsbury copper mine tunnels would make for a really good prison. Would you tell us more about the Assembly's ideas about how to turn old mine tunnels into a prison?
So I think there's two major factors that contributed to their thought process in this regard. The first being that they believed it could profitably employ the prisoners. They even said that outright, profitably employ. And so with this, had the potential to produce a profit for the colony by forcing these prisoners to work, but also prevent idleness. So idleness was believed to lead to deviance. So creating a prison system that put prisoners to work ultimately prevented crime was their idea. Initially, the prisoners were required to work the mine until it was deemed unprofitable and also probably deemed unsafe to put mining tools in the hands of prisoners. So that didn't last long, but that was their initial intent. Second, the General Assembly thought the mine would be next to impossible for any person to escape. So they really sold it as an inescapable prison. The landscape at this time was bare with the exception of the 2 mine shafts leading to the abandoned tunnels, and the Assembly believed that the caves would be secure enough that limited infrastructure and guards were needed. However, they were mistaken, and within 18 days, the first prisoner, John Hinson, managed to escape.
Yeah, it seems like if you want to make a bold claim like your prison is escape-proof, that Murphy's Law is going to kick in and somebody's going to escape from it. So how exactly did John Hinson escape? Are there any details about his escape in the historical record?
Yeah, there's not very much known because he was the only one. So like I said, they were trying to sell it as an inescapable prison. So it said that they didn't have any guards there at that time. So they probably had a door over the shaft. And the news article that went out afterwards trying to put out a reward for his return claimed that a woman let down a rope and some evil-minded woman helped him escape. And so that's all we know. He probably had an accomplice and he never returned to prison.
How far did John Hinson have to climb to get to the surface? I wondered just how far below the surface the prisoners at Newgate lived and how many caves they had to roam around in.
Some of the tunnels have shifted a little bit with the implementation of new entryway, etc. But the area in which the prisoners would have been primarily housed is about 35, 40 feet below, but the deepest point is 75 to 80 feet. And it was just tunnels. There weren't too many caves, just small tunnels. And then there were a few caves, one of them being used for solitary confinement later on, in which prisoners would have been chained separate from the remainder of the prisoners. So there was room, but it's really dark and really damp down there.
So the state actually did build some prison cells in addition to giving the prisoners free range of all the tunnels.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more of that than the cells. They didn't put exact cells. They had, like I said, the area for solitary confinement where they would chain them, but then most had rough-looking beds with straw within the more open areas of the tunnels. Other than that, they didn't spend too much on infrastructure or construction because they thought it would be pretty inescapable.
And how many men were incarcerated in Newgate after it opened as a prison? How many men were sleeping on these straw beds along its tunnels?
After it opens, it fluctuates, partially because the prison closed a few times due to escapes burning down the guardhouse, etc., and they'd had to rebuild by the time they had built a guardhouse. Overall, I think there were roughly 800 men. At any given time, probably 70 to 100. When they closed, I think 89 were transferred to the new prison.
When did the prison close?
1827.
Okay, so now that we have an idea of the living conditions the Newgate prisoners experienced, we have to ask, what was their daily life like? Did they ever get out of these tunnels to the surface to see sunlight?
They primarily used the mine to confine the prisoners at night and when they slept. So that's where they were housed. But they would most likely, from the records we have, came above ground on the shaft ladder with their handcuffs and their fetters on their ankles at 4 a.m. and they would work. So they had a prison yard that was built as time passed with workshops, and they made nails and shoes and wagon wheels. And they came up at 4 a.m. and they worked until 4 p.m., got food, and went back down in the mine. So that was probably more or less their daily life. Some of them were employed by local farmers, and with a guard, they would go off and work those farms as well.
Now, one of the roles that Connecticut played during the American Revolution was a place where other states, like New York, could send those they found guilty of being inimical or unfriendly to the American cause. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I'd really like for us to explore Connecticut's role as a place for political prisoners during the American Revolution. Today's episode is made possible by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. Now, although today's episode has been focused on exploring aspects of 18th century life and society in the Northeast, life and society in the West also underwent great transformation during the same period. And one such Western place that witnessed great change during the 18th century was the Ohio River Valley. During the 17th century, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people attacked the Algonquian-speaking people who lived along the Wabash tributary of the Ohio River. But these Native Americans survived these attacks, and during the 18th century, they rebuilt their lives to thrive as fur traders and farmers of local resources, and as peoples who frustrated imperial attempts by the French and British to control the Ohio Valley. In fact, so successful were these Native Americans that by the late 18th century, their endurance had turned into prosperity. Ohio Indian women set the standards of fashion for indigenous clothing. European visitors marveled at their sturdy homes and at the generous hospitality of their trading centers, like the one at Miamitown. But all of this wealth soon rendered these communities vulnerable for takeover by aggressive Kentucky settlers and American leaders like George Washington and Henry Knox. The story of the Native Americans who lived and thrived in the Ohio Valley during the 17th and 18th centuries is a really fascinating story of transformation and survival. And it's a story you can explore in greater detail in one of the Omohundro Institute's most recent publications, Susan Sleeper Smith's Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, Indian Women of the Ohio River Valley, 1690 to 1792. Produced in partnership with the University of North Carolina Press, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest reveals the creation and growth of this pan-Indian world in riveting detail, and in a way that also foregrounds the work and experiences of Indigenous women to build and create these thriving societies. To discover more about Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, visit benfranklinsworld.com/prosperity. And for a special listener-only 40% discount, use promo code 01BFW. Again, visit benfranklinsworld.com/prosperity and use promo code 01BFW. Morgan, would you tell us more about Connecticut's role in the Revolution as a place where other states could send those who they felt were obstructing the war effort, and about the role that the Newgate prison may have played in that service?
During the American Revolution, Newgate served as a prison for loyalists. And like you said, other states would send their loyalists to Newgate, to Connecticut. And so it was referred to as the catacomb of loyalism, and it was very dreaded by those men. In February of 1781, the governor actually issued an act for punishment of high treason and other atrocious crimes against the state. This act outlined that those individuals who claimed allegiance to the King of Great Britain or aided the enemy in any way would be imprisoned at Newgate or sentenced to death. The act also stated that these individuals would not be considered prisoners of war. And I think this is a really important concept in studying the American Revolution because the state recognized the prisoners as their own citizens and wanted to prevent them from being exchanged as prisoners of war. And a good story that helps illustrate this is that of Ebenezer Hathaway and Thomas Smith, who were captured as loyalists a few months after that act for punishment of high treason. And these two men refused to recognize the Union's authority by declining to plead guilty or non-guilty. So they didn't even recognize the Union as having enough authority to judge them in that manner. And these men were sentenced to Newgate for not pleading their prosecution. A few weeks later, Hathaway and Smith managed to escape from Newgate with 20 other men, primarily loyalists. And this was the largest escape from Newgate, and they survived to write about it later. So their account is really important to understanding how loyalists were affected by the war in this way.
Yeah, and along those lines, I wonder about the loyalists' experience. You were telling us that prior to the war, Newgate was a place for men who committed burglary, murder, horse thievery, and other real serious crimes. And yet, during the Revolution, you have all these loyalists who were sent to Newgate, largely because of their political viewpoints and perhaps for some actions to foil the revolution. So, what was it like for loyalists to be incarcerated at Newgate with all these other men who committed dangerous, non-political crimes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. So they definitely, in all the accounts that they record afterwards, they definitely considered it a living hell, as I'm sure the other prisoners did. But I like to think that they definitely had a different sense of camaraderie. So that escape that happened of the 28 men with Hathaway and Smith was the largest to escape, and it was primarily loyalists. So they had band together to accomplish an almost unaccomplishable task. So the motivation for them to do such is also very telling of the fact that they probably didn't think they belonged there. As much as any prisoner doesn't think they belong in prison, they had ulterior motives because, like you said, they were political prisoners. And we don't know what their interactions were with the remainder of the prisoners at the time, but they were more outspoken when they left. And some of their accounts are the most we have of what prison was like during that time.
Now, were the Loyalists expected to get up and work at 4 a.m. and keep the same schedule as other non-political prisoners? Or did they follow a different daily schedule?
It's my understanding that they would have been. But again, this was right at the beginning of the prison's time. So prison opened in 1773. So this was really not too long after it had opened. It's not my understanding that they had quite established that working process yet. But on the accounts we do have, anyone who came in, whether they had a life sentence or a matter of months, were treated in the sense that they worked similarly.
Do we happen to know how many Loyalists the revolutionaries imprisoned at Newgate over the course of the revolution?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how many Loyalists. We do have a rough list of those prisoners, and we'd have to count it up. The labeling used to classify them as Loyalists is sometimes hard to gather. So some of them are listed as just being enemies of the state. Some of them say Tory. Some of them say other terms that would have been used, derogatory terms, to refer to them as Loyalists. So it's kind of hard to classify them and categorize them because it's all a little different. But that's definitely a great question.
We've talked some about the day-to-day life of prisoners, and Michael would like to know more about the day-to-day life of prisoners in Newgate and how the experience of Newgate and working in all its workhouses would have been different from, say, being imprisoned in debtor's prison.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, they were definitely working during the day. They weren't being idle. And I think this is similar to debtor's prison in the sense that it was run as a workhouse. But it was different in that its intent was to reform prisoners and not to detain them for repaying their debt. But it's also interesting that, so I mentioned, they had these hard working hours and they slept in the mine, and their time at Newgate definitely seemed horrendous. But then again, there's some stories that don't quite fit this picture. So one prisoner by the name of Richard Brunton was imprisoned for counterfeiting. And while serving his time at Newgate, he produced an engraving of the prison yard, which really contributed to the historical record of the time as one of the only images to depict what prison life was like. And in addition, he painted a portrait of the warden and the warden's wife, which are on display at the Connecticut Historical Society. So it was really juxtaposing this hard life for the prisoners and this counterfeiter who almost functioned as an artist while he was serving his time.
What types of labor did the prisoners perform? You mentioned earlier that they made nails and they may have worked at a nearby farm, but we also said that that was in the early days of the prison. So did the labor the prisoners performed change over time?
So the two main items that were produced at Newgate were wrought iron nails and shoes. And there was a few other odd-end things such as wagon wheels, but these two items were really sold for profit. And they were listed in the local newspaper as Newgate nails to be sold, etc. And so workers would have been designated to these. And I think, those who had special skills were assigned to some, and then other ones were assigned to more of those tasks that didn't require these skills. But even the prisoners, so the intent was to keep them working and to make a profit. But the prisoners even used this to their advantage in terms of escape. So one story goes that the prisoners used their pewter buttons in the nail shop to make rough outlines of the keys that they then used to undo their handcuffs. So it's really interesting how innovative they were to try to escape. But those were a couple of the workshops that were primarily used.
Leslie wonders what happened to the prisoners after their sentences ended. So where did the prisoners go at the expiration of their sentences, and did any stick around in the Simsbury or East Granbury area?
Yeah, so we don't know a ton about the prisoners' life after they left. The individuals we do know information about are in our records because they chose not to leave. One man in particular is referred to as Prince Mortimer. He was a slave that was imprisoned for allegedly poisoning his master, and he was supposedly sent to Newgate at the age of 87. And after 23 years of imprisonment, he died at the age of 110. But at one point, he was deemed such a burden to the keepers that they forced him to leave. And when he left, he went to go look for anyone he knew from his previous life. But after not finding them, he decided to return to prison as a better option. And so he ended up dying at the Wethersfield State Prison, which is where the inmates were transferred when Newgate closed in 1827. And another man, he was really infamous as a counterfeiter, and his name was William Stewart. And he tried to stay around a few weeks after he was let go because he was nemesis with the warden and he wanted to make his life more difficult. So he stayed around for a little bit until returning home and becoming a farmer, giving up his crime. So those are a few of the examples. Otherwise, men came from across Connecticut and across the other New England colonies. So they probably went back to where they were from.
Wow. So the men who stayed around did so because they really didn't have a lot of options of where to turn after they were released.
Yeah, definitely. Especially for a 100-year-old man who was previously a slave. It was probably a better option at that point.
Travis would like to know if there are any connections between the Newgate prison and the way modern day prisons operate today.
Yeah, so thankfully, prisoners are no longer kept in mines, which is definitely a bonus. But some similarities include, aspects of prison work and security. So the system that was created in terms of confining prisoners with guards is definitely a system that's similar today. In terms of big picture similarities, I think it's important to use Newgate as an example of understanding who's criminalized in a society and for why. For example, the loyalists that were in prison that we talked about were in prison for supporting the crown, even if they weren't fighting in the war. So it's imperative that we always are assessing our current society and asking ourselves what historians will say about us in 100 years. So this is the way that I connect Newgate to a modern prison system, is not necessarily in the mechanics of operation, but just in how we choose to view criminals and how our criminals will be viewed within 100 years, whether good or bad or humanely or inhumanely. But it's an interesting concept to think about because we're so quick to judge how the Newgate prisoners were treated in the past.
Okay, so if we travel to East Granby, Connecticut to see and tour the old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine Historic Site, what exactly will we be able to see and tour?
Yeah, if you come to Newgate, which everyone should, you'll get the opportunity to really walk into history. So the prison yard is surrounded by the same 1802 12-foot stone wall. And within this wall stands the ruins of old workshops and the cell block, as well as the well-preserved guardhouse. So we really encourage visitors to explore the site. Guides are stationed throughout the yard to help interpret the ruin and answer the questions, but visitors have the ability to discover on their own. And we try to encourage them to look in and see and feel what it would have been like to be a prisoner. In addition, the mines are available for visitors to explore. And again, we intend to have guides located in the mine for assistance. But the abandoned tunnels are free for visitors to roam through and actually feel what it felt like for prisoners living down there. Feel how wet it is, how dark it is, which is a really important aspect of our interpretation.
Now, it's my understanding that the old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine site is really just now reopening after a decade of extensive renovations. So would you tell us about these renovations and how they might enhance our visit?
Yeah, the museum has been closed for about 10 years, primarily because of the renovations done at the guardhouse, which is located in the center of the prison yard. The entire site was built on top of mine tailings, which are more or less debris left from the mining years. And this means that the foundation is very unstable. And as part of that, the historic guardhouse was on the verge of collapse before the stabilization process began. So now that that's complete, we have a fully functioning building within the prison yard, which can be used for exhibit space and events and whatnot. So that really helps because the rest of the yard is primarily ruins.
Do you happen to have any tips or tricks for us that would help us make the most out of our visit?
Well, the mine is a must. Everyone is eager to get into the mine. There's nothing quite like being immersed in that experience. But I would also encourage visitors when they're in the prison yard to imagine what Newgate was like, not as a ruinous site, but as a complex system of buildings and people that attempted to create the United States' first state prison. So I think that this is really important to have visitors truly step into what it would have been like.
Okay, now let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Connecticut had not transformed the Simsbury copper mine into a prison? Would the history of crime and punishment in Connecticut have evolved differently? Would there have been any impact on early Americans' attitudes towards crime and punishment elsewhere in the young United States?
Yeah, I do think that the history of crime and punishment in Connecticut would have evolved differently. So using the abandoned Simsbury mines was a quick and easy way to experiment with incarceration on the brink of the American Revolution. Newgate was truly an experiment that ultimately failed, but succeeded in informing officials how not to run a state prison. I think Newgate acted as a stepping stone for corporal punishment to the modern system of incarceration that we have today. And without that stepping stone, things would have gone much differently. So I think the humane treatment of criminals became evident towards the end of Newgate's time as a prison. And without the extreme circumstances that Newgate presented, I don't think the necessary steps would have been taken to reform the prison system so quickly.
So Morgan, you told us how we can make the most out of our next visit. And now I wonder if the old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine historic site has any special events or programs coming up that we should know about.
Yeah, so we've just opened officially after 10 years, and we had our grand celebration. Continuing on in the season, we'll have demonstrations including tithsmithing and shoemaking, as well as hopefully a blacksmith. And we'll also have a large reenactment at the last weekend of September and Halloween festivities the last weekend in October. So we're really hoping to promote the site's archaeology as well as the wildlife conservation with the bats that currently hibernate in the mines. And so with these types of programming, we're hoping to really open the site up for visitors that have been missing it while it's been closed.
And where's the best place for us to look for more information about all the special events you just mentioned, as well as the prison and copper mine?
Yeah, you can definitely follow us on Facebook at Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine, as well as email me at morgan.bengal@ct.gov, and I'd be happy to talk with anyone.
Morgan Bengal, thank you so much for taking us through the old Simsbury copper mines and the old Newgate State Prison.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. Thanks for having me.
The old Newgate Prison began as the Simsbury, Connecticut copper mine in 1705, and until it closed around the 1750s, that mine grew to include many different tunnels. And it's from those tunnels that the miners extracted the copper ore and hauled it up to the surface, where the mine owners then shipped it off to be smelted and refined. Now, these mines operated for almost 50 years, but they never proved quite profitable enough. Each owner, like Jonathan Belcher, really needed his mine to produce about 4 times as much ore as they actually produced. Although initially, they did produce enough ore for the town of Simsbury to pay its minister, schoolmaster, and even to make a donation to help found Yale College. Now, mining for little profit proved to be really hard work, especially when we consider the fact that the miners had to use hand tools. Of course, the idea that mining required lots of hard work, combined with the ideas that the tunnels ran as deep as 75 feet below the surface and that convicted criminals could be housed and employed in those tunnels, really struck the Connecticut General Assembly as a great combination. Therefore, the Connecticut General Assembly purchased the Simsbury copper mines and reopened them as the Newgate Prison in 1773. Now, initially the idea was that the prisoners would live in the mine tunnels, which were thought to be inescapable, and further mine the tunnels as a way to reform them through hard work. But as time went on, the government realized several flaws in its plans. First, it realized that Newgate was not inescapable, that the inmates could actually escape from the confines of the tunnels. Second, it realized that placing hand tools in the hands of convicted felons might not be the greatest idea. So these realizations prompted the state of Connecticut to change course. They added guards. They also added a nail, shoe, and wagon wheel manufactory on the surface, so that prisoners would spend their days from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. working under supervised guard, and then all the rest of the time, when they were likely very tired, imprisoned below the surface in the tunnels. Now, a lot of what we know about the daily life prisoners experienced in Newgate comes from a very specific set of prisoners, the Loyalists. Revolutionaries believed the Loyalists were dangerous, and as such, they imprisoned them in Newgate for their attitudes, ideas, and acts against the cause of the American Revolution. And this brings us to the point Morgan asked us to consider. Who do we criminalize in our society, and why do we criminalize them? She encourages us to think about our society and assess its values by asking ourselves, what will the historians of the future say about us by who we criminalize and how we treat them? You will find information about Morgan, the old Newgate prison and copper mine, plus details about how to visit and tour that historic site, and notes for everything we talked about today, of course, on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/195. The Omohundro Institute has been the proud publisher of award-winning books since 1943, and one of its most recent titles, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, offers us a riveting exploration of the development and persistence of the pan-Indian world of the Ohio River Valley between 1690 and 1792. To discover more about this fascinating history, and to make use of our special listener-only 40% discount, visit benfranklinsworld.com/prosperity and use promo code 01BFW. Now, don't worry if you forget. I've placed all the details for our special listener discount in the show notes and in our Ben Franklin's World app. Finally, what do you think the historians of the future will say about us if they explore the people we criminalize? It's a really interesting question, and I'd love to know your thoughts. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.